Hello, this is Heather Meeker. I'm a lawyer and venture capitalist specializing in open source software. This presentation is part of a series of video presentations on open source licensing. This presentation is about launching a corporate open source project. This presentation is a little different from the others in this series. It's intended for lawyers or business persons who have been asked to approve or execute on the launch of an open source project at a private company. If you are launching a community project outside of a corporate setting or an open source business, this presentation may be helpful, but you will probably need more advice specific to your situation. If you intend to make money directly with your open source release, you have some more subtle decisions to make, and this presentation does not discuss them. So this presentation is for release of open source projects that are ancillary to the company's business, like development tools, for example. Those are the most common kinds of open source releases at private companies, software that helps the company run its business, but is not the product of a company. To protect your company's assets and reputation, you should check some due diligence items before you approve the project for release. Then you have some work to do to get the project ready for launch. Let's go through these in detail. First, intellectual property due diligence. This is an important step. As a first due diligence matter, you need to make sure that releasing the software will not infringe the intellectual property rights of others. For example, did your company write all the code in the release? If so, then you can grant the copyright license in the open source software. If not, you may not have the right to make the release, or you may be limited as to the license terms that you can use due to compatibility with upstream licenses. Next, does your company want to apply for patents on methods embodied in this software? While releasing open source code does not necessarily exclude the ability to seek patent protection, it's not usually a consistent strategy to do both. This is a discussion you should have with your patent counsel. Next, does the code implement a standard with known patent encumbrances? If so, you need to consider whether the release will cause you or others to infringe those patents. If there is a patented standard involved, you should analyze the patent risks before approving the release. As to trademarks, be sure the name of your project does not infringe the rights of others. It's best to do a simple trademark search to assess this risk. If the project will be integrated with third-party software, sometimes called a dependency, be sure the license you have chosen does not conflict with the third-party license. This will happen most often if the third-party license is GPL or AGPL. Before the code is released, it should be ready for prime time. An open source release is not about perfection, it is about professionalism. When you release your code, it will be part of the public face of your company. Here are some of the considerations. First, you should remove any stray comments and notes. You would be surprised at what programmers sometimes put in code. I know because I used to be a programmer and I did these kinds of things myself. There's privacy concerns. Make sure you remove all unnecessary personally identifiable information like email addresses from comments that might have been put there during development. There's quality. Make sure the code actually compiles, builds, and runs. You want to make sure it represents a quality that will put your company's best foot forward. Documentation. Is the code documented reasonably well? This is actually one of the elements that can make your project look a lot more professional than some others. Documentation can be difficult and expensive to write, but it's worth putting some effort into making sure that you have written enough documentation so that the adopters you expect can actually use the software. And metadata, sometimes When code has been developed over time, a lot of metadata about the release can accumulate in the source code repository. You may just want to do an entirely new clean release in order to give the project a fresh start. Of course, to do an open source release, you need to choose a license. If you want to walk through that choice in detail, you might want to take a look at my presentation on license choice. But most corporate open source projects are overwhelmingly released under Apache 2.0, mainly because wide adoption is the primary goal, and Apache 2.0 is a permissive license that will promote adoption, and also it has a patent license in it, which will give users of the code some comfort that you are not trying to withhold patent rights. Next, let's talk a little bit about execution. You're going to need to handle some nuts and bolts decisions for your project. If some of this is unfamiliar to you, your engineers will be able to help. Some attention to the details about how the project is released will save you legal troubles later on. Most open source projects are released on a cloud service called GitHub, which makes the software freely available to everyone and helps drive adoption. Your company probably already has a GitHub account. It's also possible to use other cloud services or to serve the project from your own website. If you use a tool like GitHub, make sure the release will be done via a company account. Your engineers probably all have their own personal GitHub accounts, but the corporate release should only be made via the company account. Next, because a primary goal of an open source release is usually to advance the reputation of the company, you want to make sure that you make the most of your release. So you should do a press release and have a PR plan that is ready and vetted before the launch date. Open source projects are usually curated by one or two persons who may devote significant time to the effort or developing both the project and its community. These so-called benevolent dictators usually stay with a project even if they change companies. In any case, be sure your company has budgets for the resources to maintain the project properly and that you have identified the individuals who will curate the project on behalf of your company. To do a release properly, you will need some surrounding content. In addition to your license and copyright notices, you should have a landing page that explains the purpose of the project in a professional way and explains how licensing and contribution will work. Also, documentation is a key indicator of a high-quality project, as I mentioned before. Larger projects that expect a lot of contributive activity will need a code of conduct as well. And you should always have a trademark policy so that you can make sure that people understand what they can and cannot do with the name of the project without infringing your rights. You should make sure that all these ducks are in a row before the project is ready for launch. That's it for this brief presentation. I hope it's given you some things to think about in making a corporate code release. If you want to know more about open source licensing generally, you might take a look at my book, Open Source for Business. You can download a free copy by visiting my website, going to the Links tab, and following the instructions there. As I mentioned, I'm also a venture capitalist. OSS Capital specializes in early-stage investments in commercial open source businesses. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. This is Heather Meeker, signing off.